Well, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to thank you for taking the time to join us today as the Arkansas Society of Professional Journalists presents this important webinar, which we've entitled From Stigma to Understanding Best Practices for Suicide Reporting. As many of you know, this is a sensitive topic. It's an important topic. And especially as we head into the month of September, which is National Suicide Prevention Month, obviously this is a very, very important topic that we should all be aware of. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself first, and then I will introduce our distinguished panel. My name is Kevin Kelly. I'm the moderator of this discussion. I'm also the evening news anchor for Fox 16 News here in Little Rock, Arkansas. I've been in the TV news business for 33 years. I'm also the vice president of the Arkansas Society of Professional Journalists. And back in 2014, I launched an anti-bullying campaign. It's called Step Up, Stop Bullying. And I go to schools, mostly middle schools, elementary, sometimes high schools, to talk about the dangers of bullying, but more importantly, what we can all do to try and put a stop to it. Because unfortunately, in some instances, it does lead to the worst case scenario, and that is suicide. And it's my goal, if I can get through to one student to possibly stop them from being a bully, then I've done my job. That's enough about me. I'm also joined by two very distinguished panelists whose resumes are long and impressive. Trust me, I've seen them. They're both extremely well educated and knowledgeable in the field of suicide prevention. It's my honor to introduce Aneri Pattani, a senior correspondent at KFF Health News, and Jacqueline Sharp, who's the area director for the Arkansas chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I want to welcome you both and thank you very much for agreeing to take part in this. Before we get into the Q&A session, I would love for both of you to give our viewers a brief description of what you do, what your specialty is, and why it's so important. Let's go ahead and begin with you, Aneri.
Sure. Thanks again for inviting me, and thank you everyone for joining for this discussion and those who are watching it later. So as Kevin said, I am a senior correspondent for KFF Health News. We are a national nonprofit news outlet that focuses on U.S. healthcare and health policy, and a lot of our articles are co-published with other outlets. So oftentimes people have seen them in NPR or USA Today, something like that. I typically cover mental health and substance use, which includes stories around suicide and suicide prevention for this outlet. It's a beat that I've been following for quite some time before I worked here as well, when I was at local and state outlets. And I also recently completed my master's in public health at Johns Hopkins, where I worked with suicide prevention researchers to create a free online course aimed at teaching journalists how to responsibly report on suicide.
Beautiful. And Jacqueline, the floor is yours.
Yeah, no, I love hearing that. I am Jacqueline Sharp. I'm the area director for the Arkansas chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I've been in this role about 3 years, and my job is to go and educate people on suicide prevention strategies using research-informed presentations through AFSP. AFSP is the largest private funder of suicide prevention research globally. And so that funnels into the presentations that we do within our communities. We go everywhere. We go schools, colleges, universities, and this has been kind of a new thing, although we've always wanted to help educate journalists on how reporting about suicide matters. This is becoming more and more of a need that is arising, especially here in Arkansas. So I'm incredibly grateful to be here, and I look forward to chatting about all things reporting on suicide.
Again, thank you for taking the time to talk about this important topic. We have a specific goal that we hope to accomplish today, and that's first and foremost to educate all journalists, no matter where they are in their career, on how best to report on this sensitive topic. We also want to promote a better understanding of mental health. Obviously, that's very prevalent in today's day and age, as well as suicide prevention, and provide resources and guidance. That's extremely important on how best to report on this. It's an unfortunate reality that suicide is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. I mean, the statistics are alarming. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole and start spewing those out. We all know it's out there and it's important. But there was one statistic that really stood out to me, and that is one person dies by suicide every 11 minutes. I want all of us to just think about that for a second, because if you put that in perspective, that means by the time we are done with this webinar alone, 6 lives, 6 beautiful souls will unfortunately no longer be with us. That's unacceptable to me, but we as a group, especially with the resources we have and the mediums that we play into on a daily basis, we have the power to help change that. I think it's also important to note that most people have either been directly or indirectly affected by this. I know I have, and being in the media, I'm surrounded by it. We are surrounded by it. And yet, for some reason, it is still a difficult subject to talk about, even among friends, and especially in a newsroom or a newspaper room. I don't understand that. So I guess my first question to both of you is kind of a simple question that may not have a simple answer. And it's, what are the stigmas that still exist surrounding suicide, and why is it still so hard to report on? I'll start with you, Jacqueline.
Yeah, I mean, my head is nodding all of those things. We're very familiar with, and we're constantly met with myths around suicide. So there are a lot of myths around suicide that research has disproven. And one of the myths that I get met with on a consistent basis is, if we talk about suicide, we create it. And this is a myth. We have proven that this is a myth. And we want to approach it in a public health approach. We want people to have the education, the knowledge, the tools of, here are the warning signs, here are the risk factors, here are the protective factors. There are things that actually guard us against suicide. What are those? What does that look like? And then what can we do as a community to respond to either someone in crisis? What are our steps? And then what do we do if we ourselves are in crisis? And so that's a big myth that I know that we are consistently trying to, for lack of a better terminology, bust, is that that is just not true.
And I'll
Aneri,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, please. No, I was going to come right to you to get your thoughts on this, because it's still a difficult subject to talk about.
Yes, I loved your point about, like, why is it hard to cover in newsrooms? And I think we have just, even from my own personal experience, I've seen kind of different ends of the spectrum here. So when one of my early jobs was at the Boston Globe. And I remember when I covered, breaking news, sort of if the subway got stuck, or if the train got stuck, or there was a delay, I was writing those sorts of stories. And we would write initially, like, the press release would come out that, there's a delay, there's been some sort of accident. And we would write that story. And then as soon as it became clear that there was a suicide, we would not cover it anymore. That was sort of the idea in the newsroom. And you're nodding, so I imagine you've heard this too. A lot of newsrooms were like, we don't cover suicides. The other end, I've been in places that, a celebrity dies by suicide and it's covered like to no end, right? We cover it every day. We cover every incremental finding, like it's a sort of like it's a scandal or something tabloidy. And so I think newspapers, news media, I should say, not just newspapers, have these two ends of the spectrum where sometimes we don't acknowledge suicide at all, and sometimes we overdo it. And research suggests both of those can be harmful. But there is this like middle path that we can try to, and I think increasingly are trying to find, where we acknowledge that this is a large public health issue in our country. Like you mentioned, the stats are there, we can't ignore it, but how do we also cover it in a sensitive, responsible way that's not sensationalizing it, that's not making the problem worse, but it's really focusing on what can we do to improve this.
And I'll add,
go, Jacqueline, go. No, please.
Yeah.
This is a free for all. Okay, you're the experts. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
Well, just to build on this, and Aneri, you can also step in on this as well, but I think the other critical part of this is like how we do that. Like, and there are specific things that we have to consider when we are reporting about suicide, the language we're using. What do we include in the story? What do we not include in the story? Like all of those things are really, really critical. And it's part of that. And I love that you said that there's a middle ground. It's just finding that middle ground and knowing the like, you know, barriers between of like, this is where you can exist and report, and it is safe to do that.
Yeah, and I will say that we will dive into the language of a responsible reporter on this topic in just a minute. But I'm also interested in getting your opinions on how important it is to be a responsible reporter when covering suicide. Obviously, the key word in that question is responsible. That covers a lot of ground, and we could use the entire hour just to talk about that. But for our purposes, and as it pertains to our topic, what does that mean? Because it's much more than who, what, where, when, and how.
I'll just start with like an experience and an example. So I work with a lot of loss survivors, and I think for me, the why that is important is because you're reporting on a person, you're reporting on a family. And we had a loss survivor who lost their child to suicide, and it was reported, and it was not responsible reporting, and it deeply hurt that loss survivor. I mean, they carry that reporting with them. And so I think just being reminded that you have those stories are attached to families, are attached to communities. You know, I read a while back an article that talked about suicide is like throwing a pebble in a pond. The ripple effects go through the entire community. So remind yourselves when you are doing that, that's why it's so critical, is because it's an entire community that gets affected.
Aneri, you've obviously experienced this with your background and the various places that you've worked. What does it mean to be a responsible reporter in this context?
So I think we will dive into a lot of the specifics on this, but there's a lot of things that, you know, responsible reporting for suicide often means going against our general training as journalists, because sometimes it means not including every last detail that you find. Sometimes it means not pushing harder in an interview if someone is, you know, re-experiencing trauma or kind of getting sensitive. So I think that's why it's difficult, but that's simultaneously why it's so important to have conversations like these, to have training opportunities, because I think the end goal of responsible reporting that Jacqueline was talking about is to care about our community. And I think most journalists do that. We get into the work because we care about our communities. We want to tell those stories. We want to improve things. And so if we keep that goal in mind, we just have to learn kind of when we're doing the suicide reporting to make it responsible. It's going to be tweaked and a little different from the way we report on other topics.
Is it as simple as, from a TV news perspective? I mean, in my experience, like I said, I've been doing it for 30 years plus, you get wrapped up in the deadline, the pressure, and you forget in this particular situation that maybe I need to take a step back and put myself in their shoes and be more sensitive and open and understanding. Is it that simple?
I think sometimes it really can be that simple, because the deadline pressures are real and it's something we're dealing with every day. And part of it is just, you know, being on autopilot, like, hey, we're turning this around, and we're hearing from editors like, hey, where's that quote? Or, you know, the other channel got an interview with the parent. Where's our interview with the parent? Those competitive pressures are real. And I don't think journalists are malintentioned when they are working under those pressures and doing things. I think it's just kind of our normal. And so it takes stepping back from it. I think it also takes educating editors and publishers, people higher up on the chain, so that the reporter is not there alone saying, hey, I don't want to make that, you know, second call to the parents who already said they don't want to comment. Like, I don't want to push them further, or I don't want to use this footage because it's not responsible imaging. Even if we don't have other footage, or the other footage, you know, what we'd use in its place is less appealing, I want to go with that. You have to have wider newsroom support for that.
That's a good point.
I would totally agree with that. And I think it's also knowing what resources you have available. You know, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, we have a ton of stuff, resources, PSAs, footage, things that can be utilized by newsrooms everywhere, but it's just knowing what you do have available to be a part of that. And I also think, you know, we'll talk about this more in depth, but we tell folks that if you're interviewing someone that's a loss survivor, we highly suggest that they are 2 years out from their loss, just because the concern is it could be triggering. It could be very hard for them to talk. And I think most of us recognize that when you interview someone, you give them a mic, you got a 50-50 shot of what's going to come out of their mouths. And so that's on top of that, you need to consider you have a loss survivor. And if they're like just months out from their loss, that's actually putting them in a dangerous situation. So that pausing and considering, is this good for the loss survivor, I think is a huge part of that.
Jacqueline, let me follow up with you. Well, what do you
Sure.
do in a situation where the individuals who have been directly affected by this want to talk?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think you vet it. You have to vet it. You have to, and I would even do an initial conversation of like, you know, here's what we'll ask. You know, I've had a situation, we always ask reporters to please send us questions. And this, I love, Aneri, that you said go against what you're trained as a journalist, because kind of what I've met in newsrooms is it's so fast paced. We don't have time to send you questions, but we need those questions to prep and make sure that we have the appropriate responses to it to be safe reporting. And so I would think that somebody that says, yeah, I do want to talk about it, I would absolutely make sure you're meeting with that person and that they themselves are using safe language. Because a lot of recently bereaved suicide loss survivors aren't necessarily educated on the language we use around suicide.
Can I add something to that?
Please,
Sure,
please
yeah.
do.
Yeah, I think so in my experience, when people want to speak with me, right, I generally, and this goes beyond suicide, as I mentioned, I write a lot about mental health and substance use, which means I'm interviewing a lot of folks who have mental illness or addiction related disorders. And I want to give people agency. If they want to speak, I do want to let them. I don't want to, kind of make that decision for them. But I have a very extensive consent process. It's sort of a formal word, but basically just explaining to them what it means to speak with me. When I speak with a government official, I don't need to do this. When I speak with a press person, comms person, I don't need to do this. They know what they're signing up for. But when I talk to an average person, kind of before they agree to the interview, I say, hey, here's the scope of my article. Is it just focused on your loss, or is it, broadly a trend story and I'm talking to lots of different families, or just to you, or I'm talking to you and other researchers? I say, how soon is it going to publish? Is it tonight, or is it tomorrow, or is it a longer piece that I'm working a month or so from now? Given my outlet's publishing model, I always have to tell them like, hey, we let other outlets republish our stuff. So it could show up in a newspaper in your hometown. It could show up in national news. And like, I want you to be aware of that and know where it's going to come up. And like, hey, when someone Googles you in the future, like, I think it's super brave and important that you're sharing this story, but I want you to be aware that this can come up and make sure you're comfortable with it. And so sometimes it's kind of like talking the person out of interviewing with you, which sucks as a reporter. It's not what you want to do. But I found it actually then the people who say, no, I'm ready, are one, truly ready. And two, they really trust you a lot more as a reporter and are willing to open up more with you because you've been very honest with them about what it could entail for them.
Yeah, and trust is so important. Well, it kind of takes us into a topic that I think we might spend a little bit more time on, and we're doing okay on time, but I want to focus on language. We touched on that just a moment ago, but because the words we choose, whether it's for TV or in print, can make all the difference in the world. Some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're doing these stories is, do I really need to include the method? Do I need to be descriptive and go into detail? And what about including messages of hope? Aneri, why don't we start with you in terms of language? And I know there are so many examples, and it's almost impossible to condense it down within this webinar. but talk about the importance of language when reporting on suicide.
Yeah, I mean, the three things that you mentioned are huge, and I want to focus on the method one as just one of the big things. There's like a lot of research that shows that when reporting news reports on suicide include the specific method that someone used, there is an increase in suicide by that same method among the communities exposed to that reporting. And there's been, checks that like, oh, is it just, is that a trend, or is that just something that's happening in that moment, or otherwise social media influenced? And generally it's not. It's like, hey, because, for example, when a celebrity dies, Robin Williams died in a particular way, there was a lot of reporting about the method that he used, and there was an increase in suicides by that same method. And this has been drawn out by tons of studies. And so what we can learn from that is that what we choose to include in our reporting has a concrete impact on our communities. And the reasoning that, I've understood from the research, and Jacqueline can feel free to add on to this, but I found this really helpful to learn as a reporter, is that whenever people are reading or viewing my material, there is some subset of our population, our viewer population, that is vulnerable, that is already kind of thinking about suicide, or has a mental illness, or is feeling hopeless. And so when we put out those details, what we're doing is providing a plan and a roadmap for someone who is already vulnerable. The idea is not that someone who has never thought about suicide suddenly reads this and is acting on it, but it's because there are those vulnerable individuals and we don't know who they are. And so when we produce something like this, just being like, hey, can I just say this person died by suicide rather than detailing what they did? Is the point really that this life was lost, or is the point how they did it? And more often than not, it will be that the life was lost. Sometimes that happens in a very public place, that can change things. And these are always guidelines I like to tell people. But by and large, I think we need to ask ourselves that question of, do we need to use the language around the specifics of what happened?
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree with that. Method, what we're finding in research is just not necessary. There's no need for it. Nobody really needs to know method. The one thing I would like to focus on too, just to add on, is the way we talk about suicide. So we no longer say the word committed suicide because it has such a negative connotation. You often hear people say they committed a crime. So it is, typically thought of in those terms. And then also people akin it to committing a sin. And so we're removing that language and using the phrase died by suicide or killed themselves. That is the more appropriate way to say that. And then when you're talking about, which I don't know if you guys would ever be reporting on this, but just to have, general language, we don't use the terms failed or successful attempt. It's unnecessary. It's judgmental language, and it is absolutely not needed. And so those are important things that we want to make sure that you're using, and just in everyday life, switching that. And, I brought up the example of the loss survivor who lost her daughter, and the reporter said she committed suicide. And the loss survivor said, my daughter was not a criminal. My daughter struggled with mental illness, and this was clearly not the end result that we were hoping for. And so, but she has that now in her head. And that was what was communicated to the community. So I think that's important to hear as well with language.
I think it's important, before I move on to the next question, to kind of reiterate what the two of you just said with some examples. Killed himself, committed suicide, took his own life. Those phrases attribute blame, and it also, Jacqueline, as you pointed out, makes it seem like a criminal act and can reinforce the stigma. Instead, we should be saying, as Jacqueline just pointed out, as well as Aneri, he died by suicide. It has a different connotation. It's like when we say he died from a heart attack or he died from cancer, and it starts to normalize that it's just a cause of death. Would both of you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're definitely trying to educate people that we're talking about the brain. Like when we get down to the brass tacks of it, we're talking about the brain, and we're talking about, something that is occurring in the brain, that has become overwhelming. It becomes a response to pain. And so we have to really look at it that way and then make sure we're mirroring the appropriate language for it.
Yeah. Looking at the time, I want to move into our next topic, and that is safe reporting guidelines and how they can help journalists when and if we have to cover a suicide. And inevitably, it will happen at some point. So Jacqueline, I want to start with you, and if you could address that more specifically, because I know you have some guidelines that all of us in our respective fields incorporating and follow.
Sure. And I'm going to take a minute and share my screen. Give me just 2 seconds. So you all should be seeing, this is afsp.org/journalist or safe reporting. This is a landing page that is free to anybody to utilize and has lots of resources attached to it. But I'm going to kind of just walk us through our top 10 tips for reporting on suicide and guidelines for that. So we already talked about language. The other number 2 is sensationalizing. So, it's exactly what Aneri said, excluding images or graphic depictions of suicide death, notes, location, those kinds of things, they're not necessary. And causes is number 3. So we avoid reporting that a suicide death was caused by a single event. When we go out and we talk to folks about suicide, one of the first things we tell people is suicide is complex. What research has shown us is there's not one thing that leads to suicide. It is very complicated. It is multiple things happening at once. So you may see things like somebody got a divorce and they died by suicide, and you only see the environmental aspect. You don't know that they have a history of mental illness. They have been increasing their alcohol intake. So it's very complicated, and that's important to note as well. For placement, do not feature suicide stories on front pages of newspapers or main landing pages of online media. And do not mention the word suicide or method in the headline or in the opening paragraphs of stories. And Ari, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, actually, I was going to add to the causes,
Sure.
if that's all right.
Please.
I find this one so important, but so difficult as a reporter, because I think as a journalist, but also as human beings, we like clear-cut narratives, right? We like A caused B. And when you're doing a quick story, it's kind of easy to be like, hey, this person lost their job and then died by suicide a week later. And we draw those lines, or they had a really difficult breakup and then this happened. And sometimes the people we interview will be telling us that because they themselves are trying to make sense of it. So I think this is one that I always have to remind myself of, that hey, even though the people I'm speaking with are drawing these, connections, it's always more complicated. And the only person who knew everything that was factored into it is not here to tell me or to represent that. And so I have to kind of be responsible, again, that word, and make sure I'm adding in that context of hey, even though these are the things I know happened around this person's life and the thing the interviewees are pointing towards, there's a lot more that we don't know, and being honest about that in my reporting and whatever I produce finally for the public. But I think that one's so interesting.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
And I'll add too, one of the things that we've kind of talked around, and Aneri, you might have some more information on this just from your public health background, but contagion is something that is very real. So that is when you see in a community multiple suicides happen. And we have lots of research that is currently happening and has happened that looks at what contributes to contagion. And that's part of this, is that right there. Magnitude is number 5. So this is really important. When we're talking about this, the stats are there, the statistics are there. And I often, we just did one actually with the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, where we had a block and it was just full of statistics. And a lot of times I'll ask to have that removed. I think having just a couple statistics is great, but when you flood people where it becomes this overwhelming, it can be too much. So make sure you're really watching how you're referencing it. We don't refer to it as an epidemic or it's skyrocketing, because that's panic inducing, and we don't want to do that. 6, hope and help. always, always, always show that there is help available and that there is hope. In that same piece, we ended with, there is hope, there is help. You are not alone. Here is the number to the National Suicide Crisis Line. And you can text it. So 988, if you don't know, is the National Suicide Crisis Line that changed 2 years ago, from advocacy efforts from our organization and several organizations. And so please use it. Please get it out there. It's really important that people know about that resource. Interviews, we kind of talked about, be very mindful about who you're interviewing. Are they actually prepared? Vet them. Like, Aneri said she does like a process for them. It really should be that. You should be kind of making sure that they are in a good place to actually share. Celebrities. So this is a big one that we get. And I'll give you a great example of this. Be very mindful, and we talked about this, glamorizing their deaths. But also, a lot of celebrities, if they die by suicide, their families will come out and say, this is the way we want it reported. Yeah. And so be very mindful of that. And I'll give you a great example of that. The Judd family were very specific, and they wanted it reported died by a mental illness. So that's really critical to really pay attention to that. And I know as AFSP with our PR team, we're really careful to watch that because it can get you in some hot water very quickly. Social media. So we have guidelines on social media, and we want to make sure that it includes like providing content warnings, not sharing news stories that do not adhere to safe reporting guidelines, and then monitoring replies. So this is a big one for me. And often you'll see when we post on social media, I turn off comments. And that is purely because I want to make sure that people are safe. And we've kind of said this is that we're trying to educate people, but sometimes people show up and they don't know how to talk about that safely. And so consider maybe this post needs to have the comments turned off. And so that's one thing I would include. And then 10, images. Under no circumstances should photographs or video of the scene of the suicide, including the notes, should be covered. So Aneri, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to any of these.
Yeah, I will say on the images and social media, like having comments turned off, that for me as a reporter is often a conversation with an editor. It's not a decision I get to make. However, pointing my editor to guidelines like these, or, the World Health Organization has guidelines, the CDC has guidelines, and kind of going to these large institutions and bringing that to my editor and saying, hey, I don't want to do this because of my own preferences, but those are based on these guidelines from really reputable organizations, and therefore I think we should turn off comments, or therefore I think we should not use this visual, holds more weight and helps them understand why I feel strongly about doing or not doing something.
I find it fascinating though that at least the conversation is being had about comments when as it pertains to social media. I think that's an important discussion that should be had. In terms of social media, though, I mean, we are in a world where we need to get information out, fast, as long as it's accurate. But when you look at the various types of apps that are out there, such as X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook, and so forth, and we're looking for clicks, we're looking for viewers, or we're looking for readers. But at the same time, as it pertains to this topic, we have to be extremely sensitive with even a headline, right?
Correct. Yes. Being very mindful of the way that what you're putting in that headline, I think is really critical. And then, we kind of touched on this before we started the webinar, but are you approaching it in a solution way? Are you approaching it in an education way? I think is the critical thing when you're building that headline for sure. I'm going to stop sharing. I put the link for this page in the chat, and I also added a free PDF that goes through safe reporting guidelines as well in the chat.
I think it's important that we continue the conversation in terms of including a message of hope and recovery in as many stories as we possibly can, because that can have a huge impact. I'm sure you've done that countless times, Aneri, in your reporting.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, because the same way there's a lot of research that suggests, including the details about method or other language can have harmful effects. There is emerging research that shows when journalists do report on suicide responsibly, when they include messages of hope, when they include links and numbers to the helpline, people use them, and it has a protective effect, actually. So I find that really exciting as a reporter. My goal is always to kind of help my communities, the communities I'm reporting on. And there's research that suggests I can do that effectively on this topic if I'm following these guidelines. And so what that means is, the easiest thing is, like Jacqueline said, put a thing at the beginning of your story that says, if you or someone is experiencing a suicidal crisis or having thoughts of suicide, call 988, text 988. I think that is, frankly, low-hanging fruit that every reporter can do. There's another step that is something I'm working on, is trying to, when I have stories with, really unfortunate people who have lost their lives or their parents sometimes, making sure I also try to get, if I can, within the time and the constraints of the story, the voice of someone who maybe attempted suicide but survived and now has found treatment and recovery and can kind of speak to that voice. And I will say my local AFSP chapters in different places I have lived have been amazing at hooking me up with those sources. So take advantage of that.
I love that you just said that, because that was exactly what I was going to say is, and our terminology is people with lived experience. So there's more and more research coming out about, not too long ago, AFSP was even scared to really highlight the voice of lived experience, because we didn't know what the impact would be. Now we know, and we are leaning into it. We invite it because it is that hope. It is that, it's that connection for someone. Maybe someone reads the story and they hear like, oh, that person experienced the same thing that I went through, and they're here. And so I think that lived experience is super crucial. I actually have my own lived experience, and in May, for Maternal Mental Health Month, I did a whole bunch of like podcasts and interviews and all different kinds of stuff. And the number of people that just emailed or messaged and said, oh my gosh, I went through the same thing. Thank you so much. I mean, that's huge. Not only is that huge to let people know that they're not alone, but it also is huge for me personally to be like, oh, I'm not alone. So it continues to build that protective factor for folks with lived experience as well.
And the one last business case point I just want to make is that we hear from our audiences a lot that they're tired of bad news in the cycle, that there's just a lot of it. And so the idea, Kevin, you were talking about this in the realm of bullying, but same in suicide, the idea of focusing on solutions can also be a way to increase readers and viewership. People do want to hear things that they can do to address the problems, not just the problem by itself.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when I was at one of these schools talking. I was doing my presentation and I looked over, and I usually like to walk around the area when there's 200, 300 kids in the cafeteria. And in this one particular instance, I looked over my left shoulder and saw a 10-year-old boy who was crying, and there was a teacher over there consoling him. I was like, oh my gosh, did I say something that offended him and so forth? I knew he was in good hands. I continued with my conversation. I finished my presentation, and afterwards, the young boy asked if he could speak with me alone. And the principal and the counselors and the teachers all agreed. And so I sat down with him. I said, if I said something that offended you, I apologize. And he said, no. And I said, you can talk to me. I'll listen. And this is a 10-year-old boy, and tears started coming down his face. And he goes, my grandmother burned our house down. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And he goes, and my sister committed suicide. Those were his words. And now I'm crying. And he goes, and I'm thinking about taking my life. Now, all the teachers, he was in good hands. But I guarantee you, none of the other individuals in that entire school, including the bullies who were targeting him, had any idea about any of that. And it just breaks my heart, you know. But me just sitting down there talking to him and listening, I didn't have to say anything. He just wanted somebody to listen and to provide that hope, to hear that message that, you know what, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And I think that's just one example, but on a bigger picture, it applies in what Aneri, you do, Jacqueline, what you do, and especially what I do when we're talking about these subjects. It's like communicating and getting the message across is that you're not alone. All you have to do is raise your hand and ask for help.
Yeah, I love that narrative. And that's one of our narratives, is that the first thing to preventing suicide is talking. And so a lot of our stuff is around that idea. It's important to talk about this. It's important to know about it. We've got a film. I'll pull the link for you all that I'll put in the chat, but it's a film that was produced 2 years ago called Talk Away the Dark. And it is literally a film that highlights when somebody is showing warning signs, and then that person asking directly, are you thinking about suicide, the impact that has. And it's just a really beautiful display of exactly what you're talking about, Kevin.
Well, let's kind of shift into the resources. And my goodness, there are so many out there, but which ones are the ones that we can trust? Which ones are accurate? It's critical to make it easier for viewers and readers to find additional information, as we kind of just talked about, in addition to the message of hope. But what are some of the best and trusted resources that journalists can and maybe should use? Jacqueline, I'll start with you and get your thoughts. And I know, Aneri, you have a boatload of resources, including an online program, which I want you to talk about. But let's start with Jacqueline.
Yeah, so we've got, AFSP has a lot of information and a lot of resources. I've included several in the chat, and a PDF version of our kind of what safe reporting guidelines look like. And then whenever I'm talking to a journalist, and I love to hear that the AFSP chapter is great in working with you guys, because we really try to be available for interviews and anything you guys need. And we know you're working on a quick deadline, but I always send that link and say, please review these, please know these before we go into this interview. So that afsp.org/journalist is going to be a plethora of resources for you. And then if there's something specific you all are looking for, we've got an entire department that's focused on, PR, reporting, media, all of that. And so it is me, but I have a bigger reach to me as well. So that those will be our resources that we can offer.
And
Aneri,
I'd love for you to add on to that, but more specifically, tell us about this free online course that you offer. What does it cover? And for those who have been through it, what's the feedback been?
Yeah, so this was basically my work for my master's in public health at Johns Hopkins. I was interested in suicide reporting, mental health as I went into it, as a reporter who's been covering these areas, and really wanted to create something that was accessible, low barrier, kind of easy for reporters to learn this stuff, because I went to a wonderful journalism school. I majored in journalism, but this is not talked about. There's a lot of other topics that they're covering, and this was not part of my curriculum. And I found myself, one of my first experiences reporting on suicide, ended up in a conversation with a family member who did not know that the person had passed away and it had been released. And I was 19 on the phone call with this parent whose kid was about the same age as me. And so I think reporters end up in these situations with so little preparation. So the goal of the course we created is really to just try to give people tools. And so I'll post the link in here again, but it's a Coursera course, so it's online. It's totally free. It's available in every country. It's at your own pace, so it's not live. There's sort of recorded lectures, videos. There's a lot of practice activities because we wanted it to feel tangible and applicable. And so there's things like interactive module where you can attempt, interviewing a parent who has lost a child to suicide. It's not an actual person, but like an interactive. And you can go through kind of different variations of what you'd say and how they might react. So you're not having to do it in the moment. You can practice. There's examples of you went to a press conference and the police released this information about a suicide death. What should you include from the press release in your report, and what should you leave out?
Wow.
So we try to be really hands-on to kind of give you what you need and give me what I needed to learn this. And so far we've done a survey kind of the folks who have taken it. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback, especially on those sort of hands-on elements. There's a lecture about how to interview someone in a trauma-informed way. And we've heard like it's not just good for interviewing suicide survivors, but it's also great for people who have dealt with sexual assault or mental illness or addiction or even poverty. There's a lot of things in our line of business that have caused people trauma that we're talking to them about. And hopefully this course can help people address that responsibly.
Well, I'm glad you provided the link for us. We'll also make sure that we can post that on the Arkansas Society of Professional Journalists Facebook page and other means as well, because I think it's critically important. How long is the course? You mentioned that I can do this at my own pace, which is fantastic considering how crazy our work schedules are.
Yep, that was exactly what was in mind. So if you did it start to finish, it would be 7 hours, so less than one workday. Most people obviously break that up. And the other thing I tell people is like, look at it's broken up into 3 modules. The first is about understanding suicide as a public health issue. The second is about the research that shows how media affects suicide trends for better or for worse. And the third is really like your day-to-day tips. How do I interview someone? How do I pick words? How do I pick visuals? Use the parts that are most useful to you. I mean, if you do the whole thing, you'll walk away with the most comprehensive understanding, but I'm very realistic. Our jobs are overwhelming and take up a lot of time. If you have a question about, tomorrow I'm going to interview a parent who lost their kid to suicide, watch just the lecture on interviewing. That's about a 10-minute lecture. So you can watch that and just kind of take away the tips that you need. And that's part of the benefit of having this sort of free, open, go at your own pace, pick your own adventure kind of course where you can use it for the ways that benefit you most.
Very interesting. We're kind of down into the final minutes of this webinar, and it's been very informative, very educational for me personally. So I want to thank you both, but I would love to get some of your final thoughts on this topic in terms of safe reporting on suicide. I hope and pray that we in our respective industries are making progress and things look brighter as we move forward. I'm curious where you see this going and what your final thoughts are, especially if we've missed anything important that needs to be said. I'll go ahead and begin with you, Jacqueline, if you want to give me your final thoughts.
Absolutely. So, I think for me personally, I am so filled with hope for what I've been seeing, just in the willingness to say, we would like to be educated on this. That makes my heart so happy when I speak with a group or, we work with a group and they say, hey, could you actually educate us further? That makes me so happy. So that approach is happening more and more, and that's gonna make the difference. I think the other thing I want people to hear is that you as a reporter have a very beautiful and unique opportunity to be a part of the solution, to collaborate with us in the suicide prevention field and be a part of the solution, and to highlight the hope and to highlight the help. And I think that's an incredible opportunity. So I want to make sure to highlight that as well.
Beautiful. Aneri?
Yeah, I think I am very hopeful. I've seen a lot of change in just my short career in journalism so far. I went from, not knowing anything about the guidelines myself, not being taught about it in journalism school, being in newsrooms that didn't talk about suicide, to being in newsrooms that are inviting me and others to give our thoughts and give training. I talked to a lot of journalism students in college who are already thinking about this and want to be reporting on mental health and suicide and want to do it sensitively and appropriately. So I think we are seeing a lot of change. It doesn't mean, there's tons of work to be done always, but I'm definitely hopeful about it. And I very quickly wanted to address, there's a question in the Q&A about like, if we have an example of like a journalism piece that did responsible reporting right. I will say we point to some in that course. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones we do, but one, not an individual piece, but Ritu Chatterjee, who is a reporter for NPR, she is one of their mental health reporters, does a lot of youth mental health reporting that can sometimes easily become, the scary statistics and everything is terrible. And I think she does a really great job of being very sensitive, being very human focused, and being very solutions focused. Like, what can we do to help kids and what is working? And that extends to her suicide reporting as well. So in general, would point you to some of her articles as an example.
Yeah, and I would like to also include, because I saw Remington's question as well, just as like an interview that was very successful, that was live. I did an interview last fall with Channel 5, and their team did a phenomenal job with it. You can look it up. It's the town hall for suicide prevention, and they did a great job on researching what are appropriate questions, who do we need to bring to the table. They did an excellent job, and it made me feel really great going in and being live on air with them. And then it also made me feel like, okay, we got the correct message out. So that would be my example.
I would also suggest going to, and I don't have the link in front of me, but we can put this, attach it to this webinar after we post this, but the Pointer Institute, Al Tompkins, actually viewed it was the lead story on a TV news station. Somebody had it was a suicide story. He analyzed it, and then he brought in, I'll refer to this individual as an expert, and they went through it line by line, the entire story, and critiqued it and said, here's what they did right, in terms of the language and how it was presented, the people who were interviewed in the story. That's on the Pointer Institute's website, but I'll make sure that we include it in the link as well. Maybe that will help Remington and maybe some of our other viewers as well. But they went through it word for word and gave it good marks on responsible reporting. Any other final thoughts before, because I know time is precious for all of us.
I don't know if we want to see if anybody else has any questions. I don't see any in the Q&A.
I don't either. Yes. Well, we answered the question according to the module. I will say I do want to put out the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. And as Jacqueline mentioned as well, you can call or text 988. Please go to her website for additional resources and those guidelines that she mentioned. Those are easily accessible. Please go to click on the link for. Oh, we got another question. There we go.
Yeah, I'm seeing that. Yes. Hello, Stella. Yeah, I'm happy to email anybody. So, work with your local AFSP chapters. Because we want to help you all. And so this is an area that we can help you guys get access to PSAs. And they can be mental health PSAs. They can be about out of the darkness walks. They can be all like a myriad of things. So yeah, I'm absolutely happy to help with that. The other thing to consider is looking at seizetheawkward.org. The Ad Council and our organization, as well as the JED Foundation, works to create that. It's an excellent campaign, and they also have a lot of PSAs that are free for folks to use. So consider that as well. But yes, Stella, I will email you back and get you that information for sure.
Wonderful. And then I also just want to direct our viewers and listeners to Aneri's website and link for that free online course. highly recommend that. I think that it's a valuable resource that we should all take advantage of and share with the rest of our individuals in our respective fields. So on behalf of the Arkansas Society of Professional Journalists, Jacqueline, thank you so much for your expertise and all that you do. Aneri, keep up the fantastic work and reporting that you do on not just suicide, but mental health, addiction. The list goes on. Very, very important. And I just can't thank you enough for taking the time, both of you, out of your busy schedules to make this happen.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
All right.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.